everyone, that was Karina Wilson, our special guest violinist, who just performed the opening movement of Philip Glass's A Madrigal Opera. And she played from a score written by Philip's own hand with a very specific instruction. And that is that this composition be under the direction of another creative act and the presence of another creative act. So with this, Karina and her violin created a sound wave composed by Philip Glass. This sound, the structure of its composition, was passed from one atom to the next in this room, to the atom of your body, the atom of your body, to the air, to the wall, to the ceiling, to the floor, through the atoms in the walls of the wall, depending on the soundproofing, potentially to the atoms outside in the air, traveling in every direction. So to complete this creative act, this composition of words, this talking, this vibration from an artist's vocal cords are also creating sound waves. And these sound waves are traveling the very same atomic medium as Philip Glass's opening movement, as literal, sequential, following material movements. So sound requires a medium, and so does art. Sound cannot travel without the atomic medium, and art requires that medium for expression. And for me, as an artist, the term medium in art in general, of course, is what something is composed of. So it can be paint, it can be graphite, it could be metals, glass, ceramics. But in working as an artist for almost 3 decades, which I can't even believe I'm saying that now, but, and I've always wanted to understand early on in my practice, what really is this material I'm working with? Any of them. If I was to plumb the depth of the material, would I get to a moment where I was working with the primary identity of that medium, with something that was furthest reduced, its primary signature? And that, of course, is the elemental atom. And so that beginning then, when I made that realization, my medium has always been that, so that it is at the very foundation, and it is also the medium that all disciplines share. It's a medium of which and in which we are all materially inseparable. So this is a picture of the Philip Glass Ensemble in the 70s in New York City. And as you can see, it's structured kind of akin today. You're not lying down or sitting down, but it is in the round. And just like then, as it is now, it is not that I am putting my back to members of the audience. It's that at certain moments, certain members of the audience are seeing my back. But this whole notion of this talk series, this event series called Pioneers of Practice, much like with Karina, the material is always just in practice of itself. It's not in performance. It's not lecturing. It's not instructing. It is in practice. And so with these, I'm hoping to be able to continue that. This is a quote from Philip Glass. "It's music that requires alertness all the time. If you space out, without any doubt, you'll get lost. And the audience might have that privilege, but we don't." So what you were hearing in that opening movement was what seems at first as a lot of repeating, right? But it's not a repeating. It is a repetitive structure. That repetitive structure is at the very foundation of what I was talking about, that atomic medium. It follows all the same rules, and he was able to develop a language with that repetitive structure. I'll get more to that in a minute. But what's important about this quote is that whole part of the requires alertness. So I'm sure that there were moments as you were listening that there was that moment where you could just relax and just absorb, space out, right? Mm-hmm. And that mainly is because your eye didn't need to be at work as much. It's your other senses that were engaged. And so it's the relaxing of the eye, because the eye is so dominant in everything, in art, in all forms. It is that sense of relaxation when other parts of your sensory apparatus are engaged. So that's that relaxing, that spacing out. But the other part of the quote, which I love, is, but what about the musician? What about Karina, who has to be paying attention when she's playing that repetitive structure? That's a certain sense of awareness, a certain sense of heightened focus. And that's what I'm inviting for us today, is to be in the practice of both to be in that state of complete awareness with your whole body sensory apparatus, just like Karina is when she's playing the music, as well as relaxing into that practice. Focused and relaxed. Philip Glass was very specific about wanting to create something new. And he talks a lot about creating a new language, a new technique. By not prioritizing melody, and in art terms, that's, to me, it's like aesthetics. He was able to just completely focus on structure. And he was able to find a union between the East and Western practices. His work came out at a time with other artists working in visual mediums, which was considered minimalism, but that's not necessarily exactly how to word his music. But it is getting to that primary identity, what I was speaking about earlier. When you're plumbing the depth of a composition to get to a structure of which all of it derives. In his particular repetitive structures, and you could hear that in that piece, which requires your focused awareness, but he was adding to a pattern, and he was subtracting from that pattern. He was rearranging that pattern, that structure. And when you start to hone in on that, as an artist, as a sculptor, working with this atomic medium, what he's truly doing is echoing the very principles of nature. The adding of protons evolves our atomic elements, the sharing of electrons in his arpeggios, allowing things to vibrate together as one. There are other examples that I'd like to talk about with his work in this way. One is a work called 2 Pages. And it is literally 2 pages. And on the first page, he begins with a pattern, and he adds a note to the end of the pattern and repeats. When he gets to the second page, he takes that final note and deletes it. He removes it. Until at the end of the second page, you're back at the first pattern, 2 pages. Another work is Piece in the Shape of a Square. On stage, he would set up these posts that would outline the shape of a square. He posted the score on the inside and posted the score on the outside. A musician would stand on the inside and another on the outside, and they would play the music as they encountered it. Piece in the Shape of a Square. What is remarkable about that piece is actually a deeper aspect of that. And that is, it is again speaking to this notice, like in his first quote. At every occasion, we are both a material witness and a material participant. So at every moment, your material sensory apparatus is a witness of the material, but you are also a participation of that material. And with music, that can be something that we can greater connect to. It's when we're talking about things like art and visual medium, where you need to start with music and gain that understanding and that hone that awareness, so that when you're in works with art and when you're out in nature, when you're sitting in this room, you are engaging with your body, wholly aware that I said this earlier in this morning's talk, but the atoms of your body have been part of a 13.8 billion year evolving material. And with that, the ends of your fingers, your eyes, the edges of your skin, this is a sensory node of matter. To follow the sound, follow the thought of the sound of the sound, to hear what is. Philip Glass. So everyone sitting in the room today has a story from who they were as a young one and growing up with different interests, different devotions, different fields of study. We are all multidisciplinary. My particular story is I started off with the piano, then I studied the stars, then I became a painter, a sculptor, and now I suppose if I have to call it, it would just be a material composer as an artist. But it was the piano, that first relationship, that taught me a relationship with matter itself. When you're sitting with an instrument, it's already an other, but when you're playing with it, you're in a relationship. With the piano was larger than myself. So I started developing a relationship with things that are larger than myself. Every time that I sat down at the piano to play a composition, when you're sitting at that composition, playing another person's work, you are literally joining the bench with every other person who has played that composition. When you're sitting at that composition joins us. When you're sitting there, you learn their personage. You understand why they're making the decisions that they're making. But it wasn't until studying the stars, it wasn't until space that I learned how to see. So when I said that I studied the stars, I took an Astronomy 101 class with no really prior interest in astronomy whatsoever. And in that class, I decided to write this original research paper of trying to prove the existence of another planet in our solar system. That paper garnered me an astrophysics internship at NASA, working with a principal investigator for SETI. His name is Lawrence Doyle, an incredible man. And the project that I helped him with is how to see planets around other stars. But with this sense and honing in our sensory awareness in this evolving atomic medium, I think to our probes, our satellites, it's not so much different than our brain. Our brain is not seeing light directly, right? Our brain isn't touching anything directly. Our brain is only understanding what our sensory apparatus is bringing to it. It's much like these satellites and these probes that we send to see the first light, and it brings back all that information to a darkened knowledge, right? And it also allowed me an opportunity to gain a better understanding of where our material comes from in the first place. So suns are our material forges. As a sculptor, this is very important for me because I was wanting to understand what it is that I'm working with, and to understand that all the lighter elements on our periodic table of elements, right? So just picture that. All of our lighter elements are forged in the cores of stars. Then over the generation of a star's life, and at the moment of its death, that explosive supernova takes those lighter elements and they collide into heavier elements. This is what we know right now. And so all of those elements, almost all of those elements, are created by our suns. And I use that term specifically. This is our sun. That's the closest star to us. Stars are suns, suns are stars. This is just the way that I warm up the word stars. Stars just seems to be something so distant, right? And sun, we already have that relationship. So I use this term interchangeably all the time. Music is like an underground river. The only thing that matters is if you're listening to it. Writing music is listening to it. It's not imagined. It needs to be written down. Philip Glass. For me, this entire beautiful quote, the term music, can be substituted out by any discipline, by any field of study. And this underground river, what he's listening to, what I'm listening to, what I'm working with, that is that atomic medium. That is something all fields share, and it's something that all fields work with. So having a sensitivity to this underground river that connects all things. So one of the exercises I did about 15 years ago in my studio that would kind of prime a certain work series was I would think about my eye. We're a little ocular dominant. And so a lot of my early works forced us to touch, right? It forced us to use the largest sensory apparatus we have, which is our skin, our sense of self. This is the material in contact with itself. But with the eye, and if you want to, you can join me in this, but feel the eye in your head and feel the weight of that eye. And that is 7.5 grams of the total mass of the material universe. I use these types of thoughts so that I can go backward and forward in kind of an indifference to scale. But that eye isn't something static. It's not somehow separate from material reality. That eye is this combined atoms that are part of the material universe. It's extraordinary. And you are part of it. All form is part of it. Artwork is part of it. So how did this all start? For me, it was definitely by making paint. So I don't know how many of you have made paint, but it'll send you on the same journey. You pile pigments up and you add in oil or whatever, it could be a synthetic polymer or water, and you take a muller and you begin to mull the pigment into this binder. And it creates a delicious peanut butter that you cannot eat, even though blue peanut butter and red peanut butter sounds absolutely delicious. Don't eat it. But I became completely focused on this material. And it occurred to me that I was never really, truly doing too much to the pigment other than just suspending it in a medium. That I wasn't really manipulating it. I wasn't really changing it. I was just suspending it. And then that's when I kind of had a bit of an aha moment in my studio where I realized if you want to imagine with me that formal artist palette, right? The thing on your arm, and you're putting all your colors down from all of your pigments. Now just imagine replacing each one of those colors with an element from the periodic table. This would become my palette. And instead of suspending pigments in a paint, I could actually suspend elements between states. And instead of adding oil to a pigment or adding water to a pigment, I would just be adding temperature and pressure. These are the two tools that the universe uses to create form: temperature and pressure. So I started to get my vocabulary of how I would paint form. The material universe and the artist share that same cosmological tool of temperature and pressure, assembling atoms into forms on Earth, as well as into forms as Earth. So in working with this, the walls of my studio dropped. The studio table had no edges, and I was working with the same tools as the material universe. In beginning with paint, in making my own paint, I became to do repetitive marks. Those repetitive marks are not all that different from the repetitive structure of Philip Glass. That same adding, subtracting, that same mark making of that repeated structure, that arpeggio over several strokes over a certain duration of a composition. The far piece on the left, that is a series of works where I just wanted the identity of the paint to come forward, for that to be what the work is about, and allowing all the paint to collect at the base of the plane for gravity to pull to the center of the Earth. So once I replaced my palette of pigments with elements and knew that instead of adding in binders, I'm using temperature and pressure in which to be able to create this new paint. Un was the very first form created by this practice, by this technique. And Un is a canvas. It's a canvas made of elemental metals, and it is a single stroke. It is a single artist's mark using temperature in order to be able to take that element and suspend it between a liquid and solid state. A little bit more on that. So there is such a vocabulary with this addition of temperature and pressure. The iron in this room right now, let's just say, is 70 degrees. That's a solid state. If I was to take that iron atom and take it to about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, that iron atom would not lose a single aspect of its identity. It is still an iron atom, but it would be in a liquid state. If I was to then take that iron atom and take it to a temperature of, let's say, 90,000 degrees Fahrenheit, I would be taking that same iron atom that has not changed its central identity, and it is now in a plasma state. All that has happened is that the vibrating atom gets faster and faster and faster, or slower and slower and slower, simply by the addition of temperature and pressure. A solid iron atom is a slow vibrating atom, and that same atom in a plasma state is vibrating very fast. The same form Un showed as part of a solo show at LACMA following the Highline, a series of proteus works. One of the works known from that LACMA show was permanently cited in what I think is quite possibly the most perfect site ever, because it was cited between two states, Georgia and Alabama. I mean, how perfect is that? At this beautiful Riverwalk pedestrian walkway. Hydrogen is a piece that is about 90 feet long, about 1 meter wide, about 13 inches off the ground. It is a hollow construction, and what usually I work with, if I'm going to be increasing the measurement of something, I want to hone in on a very delicate sense. So with this piece, when you're standing at the center and when you're traversing the form, the atoms of the piece vibrate a little faster as the sun is rising and then slows as the sun is setting, which changes the timbre of the piece. So as you're walking and sitting upon it, that echo, that changes the actual sound and the encounter of the work. But as you're standing there, one of the most important aspects to me, and I think a lot of us feel perhaps insignificant in the scale of the material universe, and I see it the exact opposite. Because you are a material part of that material universe. But there are so many aspects in our practice of our senses on a daily basis that can connect us with the material world around us. And one of them simply is when you bring your attention to your shoulders and you feel that atmospheric pressure, that what you're feeling isn't some arbitrary sensation. That is the whole of Earth pulling you to its center. So when you can feel that at your shoulder, you can feel the whole of Earth. Genesis is a piece that is part of the Civic Collection in San Francisco. An aspect of that work is much like how KNOUN was that subtractive aspect of the mark making. Genesis is the positive aspect of that, and it still has that protoist mark that allows you to be able to see this element between states. HELDAN is a work that began in my studio in 2006, and it too is a repetitive structure. It is a self-stabilizing form that where it is sited, when it's sited in a city environment, it allows it to collect its rainwater and enter into the city works. Every aspect of it is connecting you with the greater material medium. All of these works invite touch. They are conceived and created for that touch. Later on in my practice, I really wanted to start to focus in on this hammer and chisel called temperature and pressure that the material universe uses. And so I just wanted to do a series solely in that vernacular, titling the piece, the amount of heat that was added, and the pressure that informed the piece. And the only rule was that the material had to come back in contact with itself. This piece was heated, which is a group of elemental alloys, was heated to just over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But in order to get this 10-inch thick, 20-foot long, meter wide billet of carbon steel to come back and touch itself, that would require 6.5 million pounds of pressure per square inch. Finding a tool to be able to do that was quite challenging. But I found one, and this piece is the resulting of a 6.5 million pounds of pressure per square inch. This piece, which is definitely me as painter, same temperature, about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, just enough to be able to bend it. And then the pressure was about 28,000 pounds per square inch. And I allowed it to have this repetitive mark making, very much like how I do in my paintings, until it came in contact with itself and through that contact. This piece is intimate. It is scaled to the size of your hand, and in order for it to come back in contact with itself, It was just 9,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. The elements that went into making that metal alloy come to the surface, or the ones that are at the surface, oxidize at the surface, and they give this incredible palette of color and surface, and in its own right is a work as well. In this whole series of focusing solely on temperature and pressure, I became also interested in the spacesuit. And just like with everything else, I wanted to reduce the spacesuit to its simplest definition, which would be what a human would need to wear in order to be able to survive and exist at a certain temperature and pressure, right? A spacesuit designed to keep the human body functioning on the moon or in low orbit. But then what about here? What about what you're wearing right now? Isn't what you're wearing right now the exact what you need for your body to function at this temperature and pressure? So I thought, all right, let's do this. So let's make one for Dalal. Let's make one for La Pez. Let's make one for Detroit, right? Different elevations, different pressures, different temperatures. And that's called Spacewalkers. And that's a very active collaboration right now with Barrett Barrera. Then also in working with this, I wanted to just isolate, just temperature, just pressure. This is a series done for the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis. We spoke on that a little bit this morning. This is 11,000 pounds of iron grit that is compressed into this cylindrical form with this very subtle conical point. These are not castings. These are pure compressions of iron grit. It took 2 years to even figure out how to do that, let alone the several years more in being able to try to create a work that you could slough by human hand, and that by the end of the museum exhibition, what would be left is just a pile of iron grit on the floor that you could slough about with your feet, and then it would be collected after the exhibition, and that material would be used for public works within its city, infrastructure within its city. That couldn't happen because I just couldn't figure out a way to be able to tell the director, Lisa Melandri, that indeed all of the sloughing, that there wouldn't be a moment where 1,000 pounds of it would just fall on somebody. So I had to actually create a 1% binder, which was basically a sugar, that allowed these compressions to be basically completely solid with just a gentle sloughing. When you approach these forms, you can see every single piece of iron grit, which is beautiful because it doesn't just collect as a whole. They each remained integral to what it is and yet served as a whole. So then I'm always, as a sculptor, interested in collecting these tools. Like, how great of a temperature can I get, right? How great of a pressure can I get? Then I found out that there was a place on Earth that was going to reach temperatures 10 times more than our sun, reach a temperature of 150 million degrees Celsius, and also right next to it be the coldest place in our solar system. What I found out was happening in southern France is that 35 countries had been coming together over the last 30 years to build a sun on Earth, to realize and demonstrate the power of our sun by creating the very first utility scale nuclear fusion plant. That nuclear fusion creates this momentary miniature star, miniature meaning 400 acres. And it is building right now, and it is almost completed. And it is beyond the pyramid of our times. We can say that we are part of a generation of humanity that was able to realize, to build together a anthropomorphic, a terrestrial star on Earth. It's tremendous. And I felt that art should have a material presence. Art should have a material support in the structure of this star. And so over a 7-year project, I worked with several different committees and directorships. There's a director for each country, and then there's a head director over all 35 countries. And instead of this being something that was hung on a wall or out on the campus, I wanted us to work together to open up the blueprint and try to find a structure, a repetitive structure, something that could be anonymous, but yet supportive of the structure of the star. And what we found was that there was something that there was 40,000 of. It was this 2-pound bolt. And the bolt had a very important purpose. It kept together the structural support of the megaton parts of the star. So the process is that you could hold one of these 40,000 bolts made by a different country, and then this one that was an untitled art object made by art. Both objects went through the same rigorous testing. Both objects had to be forged from a very exacting metal alloy. And yet the only difference would be intention, material intention, which was the untitled art object. So the instruction was that it enter inventory, and that when it leaves inventory, that it's installed just with all the others. No celebration, no marking of where it is, that it was humble, anonymous, but yet art was a material witness and a material participant of our first anthropomorphic star on Earth. The people that I met in this process of this 7-year project were extraordinary. They still are extraordinary. It is a project that starts and has to have a baton pass to generations after themselves in order to be able to see this project through. But they did surprise me. And instead of it just kind of going from inventory into this support structure, the director general of all 35 countries, Bernard Bigot, who recently passed, left his office, donned on all the security equipment, and he went to install it by hand. Of course, after him following it by hand, they continued with the same rigorous way in which each one of those 40,000 bolts is installed, but it was initially placed in by his hand. This is what art can do. This is the working of art. This December, we have 2 solar probes, one NASA, one by ESA. They will be at their closest reach of our celestial sun, while at the same time, we're completing a terrestrial sun. This is happening at the same time. There will be a talk this December that is going to be called An Architecture of Suns, and it's going to be moderated by that untitled art object that is in material support, witness, and participation of that star. There is a particular structural language as well. The untitled art object, in order for it to be a bolt, has that helical incision, right? That helical twist. Also, our sun, the interior of our sun, that same twist exists as that magnetic twisting up. And within our terrestrial sun, that same helical twist occurs in that toroidal pulse. There's such a shared language. There's such a repeated structure between each one of these 3 objects. Sans Titre, or the untitled art object, is not seen. It's not something that you can go visit. It's deeply embedded within the infrastructure of the star. However, it has variations that can be installed by the human hand as well as installed by industrial crane. The 70s had a large impact on me, not only in the arts and in music, but also in what we were doing in space. We had just come off being able to take a picture of Earth for the first time. Imagine that, what that does for us here forward, being able to have an opportunity to see ourselves. But this picture here on the left was one that Carl Sagan asked to be taken in 1990. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 had left Earth in 1977 to explore planets within our solar system. But they kept going. And right before they were to leave the outer aspects of our solar system, he wanted Voyager 1 to turn around and take a picture of Earth. And there it is right there. One of the things about my multidisciplinary practice is that I'm constantly reading papers by different disciplines. I'm constantly reading work by other fields. And one of the things that I've been noticing over the last 10 and 15 years is there's very specific languaging that's occurring amongst all disciplines. And they're all talking about this temperature accelerated material phase change in Earth. This is the very thing that I've been working on in my own studio for 20 years, right? This idea of phase change, how temperature and pressure affects phase change. So it occurred to me, why don't I just take all of these collaborations I've been working on and continue them with a series of works that are focused on Earth, the form of Earth, and how temperature and pressure is informing this incredible work. So this series is called Foundation Civilization, and it is an art-led, multidisciplinary work where art is bringing together dozens of disciplines that have never been in conversation before. Large structure cosmology, perennial evolution, quantum biology, microbiology, structural engineering, natural carbon capture, direct air carbon capture. The list goes on like 2 pages, right? Like Philip Glass. But the whole notion here is, what could art be able to bring in this practice to focus on contributive tools in agriculture, energy, water, and in new materials and a better understanding of our carbon cycle. And my time in working with this star on Earth, that 7-year project, that star is called ITER, by the way, taught me something that had been in my practice all along, but something that is definitely part of this foundation civilization, which is, it is egoless, it is equal-seated, all disciplines equally share, like that underground river in Philip Glass's quote. It is not that art is intersecting other fields. That is vocabulary that is incorrect. It is the fact that all fields share that medium. So when you're in access of that medium, you're in access of all fields. Or when one field is in that medium, you're in access of all other fields. And the last one is the most important, which is joined by the long aim. Some of these projects can be realized in 10 to 15 years. Those are the fast ones. Others are 50 to 75. So earlier we were talking about how suns are material forges. And Carl Sagan had this way of saying that we are star stuff. And in working with star stuff for the last almost 30 years now, as sculptor, as artist, I feel that there's maybe even another way of saying that. And that is that all forms are material continuations of suns. All artwork is material continuations of suns. You are a material continuation of suns. Our sun, our material we don't get from our sun directly. Our sun actually came about likely as a third generation star, which means that it's a nameless, ancient star from which we get our body, our material, our sun, our earth, a nameless, ancient star. And so for me, I've been thinking about this whole notion of repetitive structure. And repetitive structure in the way that we heard earlier with Philip Glass's notes, that sense of a joined arpeggio that can exist over a certain duration of minutes. I invite you to think of the sun as also a repetitive structure, that generations of suns ago, some nameless ancient sun was the progenitor of our sun. And if you see this as an arpeggio of suns, that all artwork, your body, all form on earth is indeed a progenitor of some future nameless star. Thank you.